The microphone went silent. The stage lights dimmed. 4,000 people in the theater held their breath as Simon Cowell did something no one had ever seen him do before. He closed his eyes, pressed his hand against his chest, and for the first time in America's Got Talent history, he stopped the show. Not for a golden buzzer moment. Not for a standing ovation. But for something far more powerful. Something that would change everyone in that room forever. On that stage stood a man who had given everything for his country. A retired soldier. 76 years old. Wearing his full military dress uniform, medals gleaming under the spotlight. His hands trembled slightly as he held a folded American flag against his chest. And when he spoke into the microphone, his voice cracked with a weight that only those who have lost everything could understand. "I didn't come here to win," he said quietly. "I came here to remember." The audience didn't know what he meant. The judges didn't know what was coming. But Simon Cowell, the man known for his sharp tongue and unbreakable composure, felt something shift inside him. Because in that moment, he wasn't looking at a contestant. He was looking at a man standing at the edge of his final wish. Subscribe now, because what happens next will break you in the most beautiful way possible. 3 hours earlier, backstage, the producers were arguing. They had seen thousands of auditions. Singers, dancers, magicians, comedians. But when the elderly man in the military uniform walked through the door, holding nothing but a folded flag and a weathered photograph, they didn't know what to do with him. "What's your talent?" one of them asked, clipboard in hand. The old man looked down at the photograph. It showed a younger version of himself, standing beside a boy no older than 8. Both were smiling. Both looked so alive. "I'm going to tell a story," he said. "And then I'm going to sing one song. The last song my son ever heard." The producer's pen stopped moving. "Your son?" The man nodded slowly. "He didn't come home from Afghanistan. And I made him a promise before he left. I told him that no matter what happened, I would sing for him one more time." There was a long silence. "What song?" the producer asked, voice softer now. The old man smiled, but it was the kind of smile that carried an ocean of grief. "You'll see." They let him through. Not because they thought he would win, but because some stories are too important not to be heard. When his name was called, the man walked onto the America's Got Talent stage with the kind of quiet dignity that only comes from a lifetime of service. The audience clapped politely, but there was confusion in the air. No instrument. No band. Just an old soldier and a flag. Simon Cowell leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Howie Mandel exchanged a glance with Heidi Klum. This was unusual, even for AGT. "Good evening," Simon said, his tone polite but cautious. "What's your name?" "My name is Robert," the man replied. "Robert Callahan. I served in the United States Army for 32 years. The audience erupted in applause. Simon nodded with respect. "And what are you going to do for us tonight, Robert?" Robert looked down at the flag in his hands. Then he looked back up at Simon, and his eyes were wet. "I'm going to sing a song," he said. "For my son. He was a sergeant. He loved music more than anything in the world. And before he deployed to Afghanistan, I sang this song to him every night when he was a boy. I promised him I'd sing it one more time. I just didn't know it would be after he was gone." The room went completely silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Even Simon Cowell, the man who had seen every kind of performance, every kind of emotion on this stage, sat frozen. Heidi Klum's hand went to her mouth. Howie Mandel looked down. Sofia Vergara closed her eyes and took a breath. But Simon didn't look away. He stared at Robert, and for the first time in years, the armor he wore as a judge began to crack. "I'm so sorry," Simon said quietly. "And he meant it." Robert nodded. "Thank you. But I didn't come here for sympathy. I came here to keep my promise." The music began. Soft. Gentle. A piano melody that felt like a lullaby from another time. And then Robert began to sing. His voice was not perfect. It cracked in places. It wavered with age. But it carried something that no technical skill could ever replicate: truth. Raw, unfiltered, devastating truth. He sang about a father's love. About a boy who dreamed of being a hero. About a promise made under the stars. And as he sang, he looked up, as if his son were somewhere in the lights above him, listening. By the second verse, the audience was in tears. Grown men wiped their eyes. Mothers held their children tighter. And on the judges' panel, Simon Cowell did something he had never done before. He stood up. The cameras caught it. The producers backstage gasped. Even the other judges looked at him in shock. Simon walked out from behind the desk. Slowly. Deliberately. His face was tight with emotion, his jaw clenched, but his eyes were filled with something no one had ever seen in him before. Compassion. He walked toward the stage, and the audience held its breath. Robert kept singing, but his voice faltered when he saw Simon approaching. For a moment he thought he had done something wrong. But Simon didn't stop him. He didn't critique him. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, at the edge of the stage, and listened. The camera zoomed in on Simon's face. His eyes were red. His hand was pressed against his chest. And for the first time in the history of America's Got Talent, Simon Cowell let the world see him cry. Robert finished the song. His voice broke on the final note, and he clutched the folded flag tighter, as if holding on to the last piece of his son. The audience exploded. A standing ovation that shook the theater. People were sobbing, clapping, shouting. But Simon didn't move. He stayed there, at the edge of the stage, staring at Robert with a look that said everything words couldn't. Then, Simon did something even more unexpected. He climbed onto the stage. The producers backstage were yelling into their headsets. "What is he doing? Simon, you can't!" But Simon didn't care. He walked across the stage, directly to Robert, and without saying a word, he placed his hand on the old man's shoulder. Robert looked at him, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," Simon said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for sharing him with us." Robert broke. He collapsed into Simon's arms, and Simon held him. The two men stood there, in the middle of the stage, under the lights, as the entire theater wept with them. It wasn't about a golden buzzer. It wasn't about a competition. It was about something far more profound. It was about a father who kept his promise. And a man who finally understood that some performances aren't measured by skill. They're measured by heart. Share this video if you believe some stories should never be forgotten. Subscribe so you never miss a moment like this again. After the cameras stopped rolling, Simon stayed on that stage for nearly 10 minutes. He didn't leave. He didn't go back to the judges' table. He sat with Robert, and they talked. The crew didn't know what to do. Producers were checking their watches. The schedule was falling apart. But no one dared interrupt what was happening on that stage. Simon asked about his son. What he was like. What he loved. What he dreamed of. And Robert told him everything. About the little boy who used to sing in the backyard, barefoot in the grass, making up songs about superheroes and spaceships. About the teenager who learned guitar just so he could play at his high school talent show. About the young man who announced one day, with quiet determination, that he wanted to serve his country. "I was proud," Robert said, his voice breaking. "But I was terrified. You send your child into the world hoping they'll come back. And when they don't..." He couldn't finish. Simon's hand was still on Robert's shoulder. He didn't move it. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just stayed there, present in the pain. "He wrote me letters," Robert continued, pulling a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "Every week. Even when things got bad over there, he always found time to write. This is the last one." Simon looked at the letter, worn and creased from being read 1,000 times. The ink was faded, but the words were still visible. "What does it say?" Simon asked softly. Robert's hands shook as he unfolded it. "It says, 'Dad, I don't know what tomorrow will bring. But I know that wherever I am, I'll hear you singing. Keep singing, Dad. Even when I can't sing back." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the stage crew had stopped moving. Everyone in that theater understood they were witnessing something sacred. Simon took a breath, steadying himself. "He knew," Simon said. "He knew you'd keep your promise." Robert nodded, tears falling freely now. "I just wish I could have sung to him one more time when he was here." "You did," Simon said firmly, his voice stronger now. "Tonight. You did. And everyone watching will make sure he's never forgotten." And that's exactly what happened. Within hours of the episode airing, Robert's performance went viral. Not because it was technically flawless, but because it was real. Millions of people shared it. Veterans reached out to Robert, thanking him for honoring his son. Families who had lost loved ones in service found comfort in knowing they weren't alone in their grief. But more than that, something shifted in Simon Cowell. People who had watched him for years on television noticed it. He became softer in his critiques. More willing to see the person behind the performance. More open to stories that didn't fit the traditional mold of talent. In interviews after that night, Simon was asked repeatedly about Robert. And every time, his answer was the same. "That night changed me," Simon said. "I realized I had been judging performances for so long that I forgot why people come on that stage in the first place. It's not always about winning. Sometimes, it's about being seen, being heard, being remembered." And Robert reminded me that the greatest talent anyone can have is the courage to love someone so deeply that you'll keep your promises to them, even when they're gone. 6 months after that episode aired, Simon received a letter. It was from Robert. Inside was a photograph. The same one Robert had carried backstage that night. But this time, there was a note attached. "Dear Simon, I wanted you to have this. Because on the night I sang for my son, you gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. You gave me hope that his story mattered. That his life meant something beyond the flag they handed me at his funeral. You didn't have to stop the show. You didn't have to come on stage. But you did. And in that moment you became part of his story. Thank you for keeping my promise with me. With gratitude, Robert." Simon kept that photograph in his dressing room. Every time he sat in that judge's chair, preparing to critique someone's performance, he looked at it. And he remembered that behind every person who walks onto that stage, there's a story. A life. A reason they're standing there, vulnerable and exposed, asking to be seen. Robert passed away 2 years later, peacefully in his sleep. But his legacy lived on. At his funeral, hundreds of veterans showed up to honor him. And Simon Cowell was there too, standing in the back, quietly paying his respects to the man who taught him that the most powerful moments in life aren't scripted. They're felt. And Simon listened. Not as a judge. Not as a celebrity. But as a human being. Later that night backstage, Simon found the photograph Robert had brought with him. The one of him and his son. Simon stared at it for a long time. "You kept your promise," Simon said quietly to himself. "And he heard you." When the episode aired, it became the most watched moment in AGT history. Millions of people around the world watched Robert sing. They watched Simon cry. They watched two strangers connect over a grief so deep, words couldn't touch it. But what most people didn't know was what happened after the show. Simon Cowell, the man who had built a career on being tough, on being unbreakable, started a foundation in honor of Robert's son. A fund to support the families of fallen soldiers. To help them keep their promises. To make sure their stories were never forgotten. Because that night, on that stage, Simon Cowell learned something he had never fully understood before. That sometimes, the most powerful performance isn't about talent. It's about truth. It's about love. It's about a father who refused to let his son's memory fade into silence. And it's about a man who finally realized that the greatest act of strength isn't in being unbreakable. It's in allowing yourself to break, so that others know they're not alone. Robert never won America's Got Talent. But he won something far more important. He won the heart of a man who the world thought had none. And in doing so, he reminded everyone watching that behind every uniform, every flag, every medal, there is a story. A life. A love that never dies. If this story moved you, share it. Subscribe. And remember, some promises are worth keeping, no matter how much they cost.